Jasmine Walters, a 28-year-old waitress, lived in Memphis, Tennessee, a city famous for its rich musical history and deep cultural roots. She worked long shifts at a small diner in downtown Memphis, where she often spent her breaks scribbling lyrics on napkins and humming melodies under her breath. Her colleagues and regular customers knew about her dreams of becoming a professional singer. For Jasmine, singing wasn't just a hobby, it was a way to escape the routine of her life, the long hours, and the monotony of scraping by paycheck to paycheck. Her voice was remarkable, powerful yet soothing, with a soulful depth that left listeners captivated. Locals who had the privilege of hearing her perform at open mic nights often remarked that she had the kind of talent destined for greater things. Despite her humble background, Jasmine had an unwavering determination to break into the music industry. She regularly attended small, informal music events in the city, hoping to be noticed by someone who could help her achieve her goal. On the weekends, she participated in local music showcases and open mic nights held in bars and community centers. Over time, her reputation grew, and she started attracting small but loyal audiences. Her ability to blend soulful lyrics with a mesmerizing stage presence made her a standout among the crowd. However, the music industry in Memphis, like in many other cities, was as competitive as it was unpredictable. Talent wasn't always enough. Connections and opportunities often played a bigger role than raw skill. Jasmine's ultimate goal was to secure a contract with a record label, but breaking into the industry felt like an impossible climb. She sent out demos to various labels and producers but rarely received a response. Occasionally, she would meet people at events who promised to make some calls on her behalf, but those promises often led nowhere. Still, Jasmine wasn't deterred. She believed that persistence was the key, and she was willing to put herself out there, no matter how many closed doors she faced. One evening, after a particularly impressive performance at a small downtown venue, Jasmine was approached by a man who introduced himself as someone connected to the local music scene. He claimed to know influential people and handed her a sleek black card with minimal text, an address, a date, and a time. The invitation was for a private music industry party, the kind that was rumored to attract producers, managers, and artists. Events like these were rare and often inaccessible to unknown singers like Jasmine. This could be the opportunity she had been waiting for. Over the next few days, Jasmine told a few close friends about the invitation. While some shared her excitement, others expressed concern. Stories of exploitation and crime in the music industry weren't uncommon, especially at exclusive, unsupervised events. Friends warned her to be careful, to have an exit plan, or even to skip the event entirely. But Jasmine dismissed their concerns. She had spent years waiting for a moment like this, and she wasn't about to let fear hold her back. On the night of the party, Jasmine carefully selected her outfit, choosing a sleek black dress that was both elegant and understated. She wanted to make an impression but not stand out too much. Her hair was styled simply, and she wore minimal makeup, letting her natural beauty shine through. As she looked in the mirror before leaving, she felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. This could be the night that changed her life. The venue was located on the outskirts of the city, a large, dimly lit house surrounded by tall trees. The driveway was filled with luxury cars, and the faint sound of music and laughter spilled out onto the lawn. Jasmine hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, overwhelmed by the sight of well-dressed guests mingling and drinking in the lavishly decorated space. She quickly realized that most people there were strangers to her, though their confident demeanor suggested they were accustomed to events like these. She didn't know who was who, but she was determined to network and make an impression. As the night went on, Jasmine tried to stay focused on her goal. She chatted with a few people, introducing herself and casually mentioning her passion for music. While some seemed genuinely interested, others dismissed her, clearly more concerned with their own agendas. The air was thick with ambition and subtle tension. Jasmine felt out of place, but refused to let it show. She circulated the room, hoping to find someone who could give her a real opportunity. By midnight, Jasmine began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere. Conversations grew louder, and some guests seemed less friendly, their actions more aggressive. Alcohol flowed freely, and the once glamorous vibe of the party turned darker. Jasmine kept to herself, trying to navigate the space without drawing too much attention. Unbeknownst to her, the night was about to take a sinister turn, one that would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about chasing her dreams in the music industry. The party was held in a secluded, upscale house on the outskirts of Memphis. It was the kind of venue designed to impress, dimly lit with soft, ambient lighting, and adorned with lavish decorations that suggested wealth and exclusivity. Expensive cars lined the driveway, and inside, the atmosphere was filled with the murmur of conversation, bursts of laughter, and the bass-heavy thrum of music playing in the background. Jasmine had arrived feeling cautiously optimistic. She was dressed to fit in, her sleek black dress understated yet elegant. This was her chance to meet influential people, to network, to finally break into the music industry. But from the moment she stepped inside, she felt out of place. The crowd was different from what she had expected. Instead of producers and industry professionals, many of the attendees seemed to be there to flaunt their status rather than to engage with the music. Men in designer suits held court in clusters, their conversations punctuated by loud laughter and occasional glances at the women in the room. The women, equally well-dressed, appeared guarded, their smiles careful and measured. Jasmine noticed that the energy in the room felt oddly charged, as if a layer of tension lingered beneath the surface. She tried to immerse herself in the event, introducing herself to a few people and mentioning her music. Some nodded politely, offering vague encouragement, but the connections she sought didn't materialize. As the evening progressed, the crowd grew louder, and the conversations became less focused. Drinks flowed freely, and the air began to feel heavy with the unmistakable mix of alcohol and egos. Jasmine stayed near the edges of the room, scanning for anyone who might genuinely be interested in her work, but the unease in her chest continued to grow. It was around this time that Lamar approached her. He was tall and well-dressed, exuding a self-assured confidence that bordered on arrogance. His smile was broad, but there was something unsettling about the way his eyes lingered on her. He introduced himself casually, claiming to be connected to the local music scene. At first, Jasmine saw this as an opportunity, finally, someone who might take her seriously. But as the conversation progressed, his intentions became clearer. Lamar's comments were laced with flirtation, his compliments veering into territory that made her uncomfortable. Jasmine tried to steer the conversation back to music, but Lamar wasn't interested. He stepped closer, his tone shifting from charming to insistent. She maintained her composure, politely declining his advances, but his persistence only grew. He seemed annoyed by her resistance, his demeanor darkening with each attempt to deflect him. Jasmine's unease turned to alarm as he reached out and placed a hand on her arm, his grip firm and unwelcome. She pulled away, her voice steady but firm as she signaled that his behavior was inappropriate. The exchange drew the attention of a few people nearby, but they quickly looked away, unwilling to intervene. Lamar's expression hardened, his smile disappearing. The atmosphere around them seemed to shift, the tension palpable. Jasmine took a step back, intending to walk away, but Lamar grabbed her wrist before she could move. His grip tightened, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Jasmine's heart raced as she tried to free herself, her instinct screaming that she needed to get away. Lamar's face twisted with anger, and before she could react, he raised his hand and struck her across the face. The force of the blow sent her reeling. She stumbled, her heels slipping on the polished floor, and fell backward. Her head struck the edge of a nearby table with a sickening thud. Jasmine's vision blurred as pain radiated through her skull. The room spun, the voices around her fading into a distant hum. She struggled to stay conscious, but the combination of the impact and the shock overwhelmed her. Her body went limp as she collapsed onto the floor, her world fading to black. The last thing she heard before losing consciousness was the sound of Lamar's voice, sharp and angry, cutting through the noise of the party. Jasmine regained consciousness in complete darkness. The air in the room was cold and stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that made her stomach churn. She tried to move, but quickly realized her wrists and ankles were bound tightly with what felt like rough rope, cutting into her skin every time she shifted. Her body ached all over, and a sharp pain throbbed at the back of her head where she had struck it during the fall. The floor beneath her was cold and hard, likely concrete, and her cheek rested against its gritty surface. Her disoriented mind struggled to piece together how she had ended up there, but fragments of the party and the altercation with Lamar began to surface. Fear tightened her chest as she realized she was no longer at the party and had no idea where she was. She strained to hear any sounds beyond the steady pounding of her heart. The silence was oppressive, amplifying her growing panic. She tested the strength of the bindings on her wrists, twisting and pulling in desperation, but the knots held firm. The effort left her skin raw and her muscles sore. Her breaths grew shallow, and tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay calm, knowing that panic would only make things worse. Suddenly, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. They were slow and deliberate, each step echoing against the walls of what she now suspected was a small, windowless room. A metallic clink followed, like the sound of a key turning in a lock. The door creaked open, allowing a sliver of dim light to spill into the room. Jasmine squinted, her eyes adjusting to the faint glow, and saw the silhouettes of several men standing in the doorway. Her stomach dropped when she recognized one of them, Lamar. The men entered the room, their shadows stretching across the floor. Lamar led the group, his expression cold and devoid of remorse. Behind him were two others, both larger and equally intimidating. They carried themselves with a casual arrogance that suggested they had done this before. Jasmine's heart raced as they closed the door behind them, plunging the room back into near darkness. She could feel their eyes on her, sizing her up like prey. Lamar crouched down beside her, his face now illuminated by the faint light from the hallway. His smirk was cruel, his eyes glinting with malice. He spoke in a low voice, his words dripping with mockery as he taunted her. The other men laughed, their jeers echoing in the small space. They called her names, mocking her confidence and accusing her of thinking she was better than them. Jasmine clenched her teeth, refusing to let them see her cry, but her trembling body betrayed her fear. What followed was an ordeal that Jasmine could never have imagined in her worst nightmares. One by one, the men took turns assaulting her, their cruelty escalating with each act. They ignored her cries, her pleas for mercy, and her desperate attempts to reason with them. Every time she tried to scream, a hand would clamp over her mouth or a blow would silence her. The cold floor offered no comfort, and the rough ropes dug deeper into her flesh as she struggled against them. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as the men continued their assault. They treated her as if she were nothing more than an object, a target for their rage and twisted desires. The room filled with their laughter, a cruel soundtrack to Jasmine's suffering. At one point, she managed to kick out at one of them, but her resistance only provoked more violence. A heavy blow to her ribs left her gasping for air, and she stopped fighting, her body too weak to endure any more. When it was finally over, Jasmine lay motionless on the floor, her body bruised and broken. Her mind was a haze of pain and terror, and her spirit felt shattered. The men stood over her, talking amongst themselves as if she weren't even there. She could hear the scrape of a chair being dragged across the floor and the sound of bottles clinking, as if they were celebrating their vile acts. Lamar crouched down once more, gripping her chin and forcing her to look at him. His voice was low and menacing as he delivered a final insult before standing and leaving the room with the others. The door slammed shut, and Jasmine was left alone in the suffocating darkness once again. She could hear their laughter fading as they walked away, the sound replaced by the dull ringing in her ears. Her body throbbed with pain, and she felt as though every ounce of strength had been drained from her. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, and silently prayed for a way out of the nightmare. The hours of torment finally came to an end, but not because the men were finished with Jasmine. It became clear that they had no intention of letting her leave alive. They exchanged brief, cold discussions, their words detached and calculated as they decided on the next step. Jasmine, still lying on the cold concrete floor, could barely move. Her body was battered and broken, her strength depleted, and her mind clouded with shock and pain. She felt hands roughly grab her arms and legs, lifting her as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. Her wrists and ankles were still tightly bound, and a gag was forced into her mouth, cutting off any attempt to scream. The men carried her out of the room, down a dimly lit hallway, and out into the night. The cold air hit her exposed skin, but it did little to revive her. She was thrown into the trunk of a car like discarded garbage, her body landing awkwardly on the hard metal surface. The trunk slammed shut, plunging her into complete darkness once again. She could hear the muffled sounds of the men's voices outside, followed by the rumble of the car's engine as it roared to life. The vehicle began to move, and Jasmine felt every bump and turn as it sped through the streets. Inside the trunk, she struggled to remain conscious. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape, but her body refused to cooperate. She tried to wiggle her hands free of the bindings, but the rough rope only dug deeper into her wrists, causing more pain. Her breathing was labored, the gag making it nearly impossible to take full breaths. Every second felt like an eternity as the car traveled farther and farther from any hope of safety. She knew she was being taken somewhere isolated, and the realization filled her with a deep sense of dread. After what felt like an endless drive, the car came to an abrupt stop. The engine was turned off, and she heard the sound of car doors opening and slamming shut. The trunk was yanked open, and bright light from the car's rear flooded in, momentarily blinding her. Rough hands grabbed her once more, pulling her out of the trunk and dragging her onto the uneven ground. The cold dirt scraped against her skin as she was unceremoniously dropped onto the ground. The air was heavy and still, the only sounds coming from the faint rustle of dry grass and the men's footsteps as they moved around her. The area was desolate, an abandoned lot on the outskirts of the city. The ground was covered in patches of overgrown weeds and scattered debris, with no signs of life or activity nearby. The moonlight cast long shadows across the barren landscape, adding to the eerie silence. Jasmine tried to lift her head, but her strength failed her. She could feel the dirt beneath her cheek, cold and unforgiving, as she lay there, unable to move. Lamar, standing over her, pulled a pistol from his waistband. The metallic glint of the weapon caught the moonlight, and Jasmine's heart sank as she realized what was about to happen. She tried to plead, but the gag in her mouth muffled her cries. The other men stood nearby, watching silently, their expressions devoid of emotion. There was no hesitation as Lamar raised the gun and aimed it at her. The first shot rang out, breaking the silence of the night. The bullet struck Jasmine in the chest, sending a searing pain through her body. She gasped for air, but the impact had knocked the wind out of her. Another shot followed, hitting her in the stomach, then another in her leg. The pain was excruciating, each bullet tearing through flesh and bone, leaving her helpless and bleeding on the cold ground. Her body convulsed with each shot, but she was too weak to fight back. The men watched as she lay motionless, blood pooling around her and soaking into the dirt. They stood in silence for a moment, as if ensuring their task was complete. Satisfied that she was no longer a threat, they turned and walked back to the car. The engine started again, and the vehicle disappeared into the distance, leaving Jasmine alone in the darkness. For several minutes, there was nothing but silence. Jasmine's body lay still, her breathing shallow and labored. Blood continued to seep from her wounds, staining the earth beneath her. The pain was unbearable, but somewhere deep inside her, a spark of determination refused to die. With every ounce of strength she had left, she began to move. Her fingers twitched, then her arms. Slowly, agonizingly, she rolled onto her side, gasping for air as the gag slipped from her mouth. She knew she was on the verge of death, but her will to survive was stronger than the pain. Inch by inch, she began to crawl, leaving a trail of blood in her wake. The abandoned lot was vast and desolate, but in the distance, she thought she saw a faint light, perhaps a street lamp or a passing car. Clinging to that glimmer of hope, she forced herself to keep moving. Her vision blurred, and her body screamed for her to stop, but she refused to give up. The world around her faded in and out as she crawled through the dirt and weeds, each movement a monumental effort. By the time she reached the edge of the lot, her body was on the verge of collapse. She could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, a sound that gave her a small measure of comfort. With one final push, she dragged herself onto the side of a deserted road and collapsed, her bloodied body illuminated by the headlights of an approaching vehicle. The car screeched to a halt, and Jasmine heard the sound of a door opening before she finally lost consciousness. Jasmine's body lay limp and broken on the edge of the abandoned lot, her wounds bleeding profusely, staining the cold ground beneath her. She drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain from the gunshots radiating through her entire body. Each shallow breath she took was a struggle, her chest heaving with the effort to draw air. Her mind was clouded with confusion and agony, but somewhere deep inside, a primal instinct to survive began to take hold. She knew she was dying, the blood loss was severe, and the cold night air only accelerated the chill spreading through her body. Yet, she refused to let herself succumb to the darkness that threatened to consume her. Summoning what little strength remained, Jasmine forced her body to move. Her fingers clawed at the dirt, her nails digging into the earth as she pulled herself forward. Each movement sent waves of pain through her limbs, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through it. Her vision was blurred, and her head pounded from the trauma, but she could make out faint shapes in the distance, bushes, rocks, and what looked like the faint glimmer of light far ahead. It might have been a road, or perhaps her mind playing tricks on her, but it was the only hope she had. As she crawled, her progress was slow and tortuous. The rough terrain of the lot was littered with debris and jagged rocks that scraped against her skin, leaving fresh cuts and bruises. Blood continued to seep from the gunshot wounds in her chest, abdomen, and legs, leaving a dark, crimson trail behind her. Her breathing became more labored with every inch she moved, and her body screamed for her to stop. But Jasmine's determination overpowered the physical agony. She knew that stopping meant death, and she wasn't ready to give up. The bushes ahead posed another challenge. The sharp branches tore at her arms and face as she forced her way through, each movement an excruciating test of her resolve. She stumbled, fell, and lay motionless for a moment, her body trembling from exhaustion and shock. But the thought of her family, her dreams, and the injustice of what had been done to her drove her forward. She dug her fingers into the dirt once more and continued to crawl, inching her way closer to the distant light. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jasmine reached the edge of the lot. She collapsed onto a patch of uneven ground, her body heaving with the effort of survival. The faint hum of traffic reached her ears, a sound that reignited a flicker of hope within her. She was near a road. Summoning her last reserves of strength, she pushed herself upright, her legs too weak to stand, forcing her to drag herself forward. Her hand scraped against the gravel as she inched closer to the faint glow of headlights in the distance. As a pair of lights approached, she realized it was a truck. It was her only chance. Jasmine used the last of her energy to wave her arms weakly, her voice hoarse and barely audible as she tried to scream for help. The truck's headlights illuminated her bloodied and battered form, and the vehicle came to an abrupt halt. She heard the crunch of boots on gravel as the driver rushed toward her, but before she could process what was happening, her body finally gave out, and she collapsed into unconsciousness. The truck driver acted quickly, calling emergency services as he assessed the severity of her injuries. Jasmine's body was cold to the touch, her pulse weak and erratic. Blood soaked her clothes and the ground around her, a stark indication of the life-threatening wounds she had sustained. The driver stayed with her, speaking words of reassurance even though she couldn't hear him. Within minutes, the distant sound of sirens grew louder, and paramedics arrived on the scene. The medical team worked swiftly, carefully lifting Jasmine onto a stretcher and stabilizing her for transport. They noted the severity of her gunshot wounds, the extent of blood loss, and the signs of shock. She was barely clinging to life, but there was still a chance. The ambulance sped toward the nearest hospital, its sirens cutting through the stillness of the night. Inside, paramedics worked tirelessly, administering fluids and applying pressure to her wounds to stem the bleeding. When they arrived at the hospital, a trauma team was already waiting. Jasmine was rushed into surgery, her battered body a testament to the horrors she had endured. Doctors and nurses worked through the night, performing multiple procedures to remove the bullets, repair internal damage, and stabilize her vital signs. Her survival was nothing short of miraculous, but her fight was far from over. Jasmine's body had endured unspeakable trauma, and the road to recovery would be long and arduous. Yet, against all odds, she had made it through the night, her will to live defying even the most harrowing circumstances. Jasmine's survival defied every expectation. Her doctors referred to it as a miracle, given the extent of her injuries and the blood loss she had suffered. She remained in the intensive care unit for weeks, undergoing multiple surgeries to remove bullets, repair internal damage, and stabilize her condition. Her body was frail, covered in scars and bruises, and she faced a grueling recovery process that included physical therapy and pain management. Yet, despite the physical toll, Jasmine's mind was sharp, and her will to seek justice was unwavering. Her family and friends rallied around her during this critical time, offering emotional support and helping her navigate the aftermath of the horrific events. Police officers were stationed outside her hospital room for her protection as the investigation into her attackers gained momentum. Detectives visited Jasmine as soon as she was strong enough to speak. Though it was painful for her to recount the events, she insisted on giving her full account, determined to bring the men who had brutalized her to justice. Jasmine's testimony was the cornerstone of the investigation. She provided detailed descriptions of her attackers, the events of the night, and the location where she had been assaulted and left for dead. Despite the emotional and physical pain of reliving the ordeal, she remained composed and cooperative, knowing that her bravery could prevent these men from harming anyone else. Her account, combined with the evidence collected from the crime scenes, gave investigators a clear direction. The forensic evidence proved instrumental in identifying the perpetrators. DNA samples taken from Jasmine and the abandoned lot matched records in the criminal database, directly linking Lamar and his associates to the crime. Surveillance footage from nearby streets confirmed their vehicles' movement to and from the lot, providing a timeline that corroborated Jasmine's testimony. Tire tracks found at the scene matched those of the car registered to one of the men, further solidifying the case. The investigation left little room for doubt about their involvement. Within weeks, police arrested Lamar and his two accomplices, charging them with a litany of crimes, including attempted murder, sexual assault, and kidnapping. The arrests sent shockwaves through the community. Lamar, who had a reputation for charm and influence, was revealed to have a dark and violent side that many had never suspected. His accomplices, emboldened by his leadership, were similarly implicated in past crimes, though none as brutal as the attack on Jasmine. The case drew significant media attention, with public outrage mounting as details of the crime emerged. As the trial date approached, Jasmine worked closely with prosecutors to prepare her testimony. The district attorney's office assembled an airtight case, relying on the wealth of evidence gathered during the investigation. The courtroom was packed on the day Jasmine took the stand. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but reporters documented every detail, knowing that her testimony would be the turning point in the trial. When Jasmine entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. She walked slowly, her movements careful due to her lingering injuries, but her resolve was evident. Taking the stand, she recounted the events with remarkable clarity, describing each harrowing moment in vivid detail. Her words painted a horrifying picture of the violence she had endured, and the courtroom sat in stunned silence as she spoke. Tears streamed down the faces of some jurors, while others clenched their jaws, visibly affected by her courage and resilience. The defense attorneys attempted to discredit her, insinuating that her recollection might be flawed due to the trauma and questioning the severity of the attack. However, the prosecution countered with forensic evidence that was irrefutable. DNA results, surveillance footage, and witness testimonies created a damning narrative that left no room for alternative explanations. The defendants' attempts to plead innocence were further undermined by inconsistencies in their alibis and the discovery of incriminating text messages exchanged between them on the night of the crime. Throughout the trial, Jasmine remained composed, even as the defense tried to rattle her. She answered every question with poise, refusing to let her attackers' lawyers diminish her credibility. Her unwavering determination to seek justice inspired everyone in the room, including the judge, who commended her bravery during closing remarks. The jury deliberated for less than a day before delivering a unanimous verdict, guilty on all charges. Lamar and his accomplices showed no visible reaction as the judge read their sentences. Each received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that they would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause as the gallery, filled with Jasmine's family and supporters, expressed their relief and satisfaction with the outcome. The trial marked a turning point not only for Jasmine but also for the community. Her courage in facing her attackers and recounting her trauma publicly served as a beacon of hope for other survivors of violence. It was a reminder that justice, though often a long and painful process, could prevail when the truth was pursued relentlessly. For Jasmine, the verdict brought a sense of closure, though she knew that the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain with her for the rest of her life. Despite this, she emerged from the trial with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to use her voice to advocate for others and ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had survived. Several months had passed since the trial, and Jasmine Walters began to rebuild her life. Though the physical scars of her ordeal remained, they were overshadowed by the resilience and determination that now defined her. She had emerged from the horrors of her attack and the grueling courtroom battle with a renewed sense of purpose. Jasmine understood that she had survived for a reason, and she was determined to use her voice to make a difference. Her recovery had been anything but easy. Physical therapy sessions were long and painful as she worked to regain strength and mobility. Each step reminded her of the bullets that had torn through her body and the nights spent fighting for her life. The emotional wounds were equally challenging. She endured sleepless nights plagued by nightmares and flashbacks, but with the support of her family and a skilled therapist, she slowly found a way to confront the trauma. Every day was a battle, but Jasmine faced it with the same courage she had shown in the hospital and courtroom. As she healed, Jasmine became increasingly aware of the power her story held. Local media had covered her trial extensively, and her survival had captured the attention of many. Letters and messages poured in from strangers who were inspired by her strength, including other survivors of violence who found solace in her courage. Jasmine realized that her story wasn't just her own, it belonged to countless others who had suffered in silence. She decided to take action. Jasmine began volunteering at local shelters and support groups for victims of violence. She shared her story in small, intimate settings, speaking to women and men who had experienced similar traumas. Her words carried weight, not just because of the tragedy she had endured, but because of the hope she now embodied. She encouraged survivors to seek justice, to reclaim their lives, and to never let their voices be silenced. Jasmine's presence became a source of comfort and empowerment, and she quickly became a respected advocate in her community. It wasn't long before Jasmine's love for music found its way back into her life. Music had always been her refuge, and now it became her platform for healing and advocacy. She began performing again, but her songs carried a new depth. Each performance was infused with the pain she had endured and the strength she had discovered. Her lyrics spoke of survival, resilience, and the unyielding human spirit. Audiences were moved by her authenticity, and her voice, once nearly silenced, now resonated louder than ever. Jasmine's return to the stage marked a turning point. She performed at benefit concerts for victims of violence, using her platform to raise awareness and funds for local organizations. Her performances were raw and emotional, often leaving audiences in tears. Critics praised her for her ability to transform personal tragedy into powerful art. Her music began to gain traction beyond Memphis, and she was invited to perform at larger events, including national conferences on violence prevention and survivor advocacy. Through her work, Jasmine became a symbol of hope. Her name was mentioned in conversations about resilience and justice, and her story was used as a case study in law enforcement and advocacy training programs. Despite her growing recognition, she remained grounded, focusing on the mission that had driven her from the start, to give a voice to the voiceless and ensure that no one felt alone in their suffering. Jasmine's impact extended beyond her music and advocacy. She collaborated with local lawmakers to push for stronger protections for victims of violence and increased penalties for offenders. Her testimony before a state legislative committee helped pass new laws aimed at preventing crimes like the one she had survived. These achievements gave her a sense of closure, knowing that her pain had led to meaningful change. As months turned into years, Jasmine's life continued to evolve. Her music career flourished, and her advocacy efforts grew. She launched a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting survivors, providing resources for healing, and promoting community education. The organization hosted workshops, provided legal assistance, and connected survivors with therapists and support networks. Jasmine personally mentored young women who had experienced trauma, offering them the guidance she wished she'd had during her darkest moments. Jasmine's story was a testament to the power of resilience. It reminded everyone who heard it that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the human spirit could endure and triumph. She refused to let her attackers define her, choosing instead to use her experience as a catalyst for change. Her voice, once nearly extinguished, had become a beacon of hope, shining light into the darkest corners. In every performance, and every speech, and in every interaction, Jasmine carried a simple but profound message: no act of violence could destroy the will to live. Her voice, strengthened by pain but fueled by purpose, echoed far beyond the stage. It became a reminder to all who heard it that, even in the most harrowing circumstances, there was always the possibility of healing, of justice, and of hope. Jasmine Walters had not only survived, she had risen, proving that no cruelty could silence a voice determined to be heard.